Hello, everyone. It's nice to see your faces, and you're very welcome to today's seminar. My name is Ellie Perkins, and I'm a professor and a research associate at the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages at York University. I have the honor of introducing our speaker on the topic of navigating water systems change with the ebb and flow of Indigenous knowledges. I invite all of you who are joining us today to take a moment to recognize the territories where you live and work. There may be some people who are not from Ontario, so you can check the map at nativeland.ca if you're interested to see all the Indigenous territories across Turtle Island and the world. York University and Toronto are within the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, which have long-standing relationships with these territories that far precede the establishment of York University. This area has been caretaken by the Anishinabek Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement among First Nations to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region, which dates back to at least the year 1142. Today's speaker, Rachel Arsenault, is an Anishinabek Kwe from Wiikwemkoong Unceded First Nation on Manitoulin Island. She holds a master's degree in Indigenous Relations with a focus on the First Nation water crisis and how this is impacting First Nations in Ontario. As a York University PhD student in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, Rachel is in the process of completing her comprehensives this spring, and she aspires to complete her dissertation by early summer 2024, which is well awaited. We're looking forward to that. Following Rachel's talk, we will have some time for questions and discussion. Thank you so much for sharing your research and knowledge with us today, Rachel.
Thank you for that introduction. Okay, and with that, I will launch my presentation. Okay. Not the most tech savvy, so hopefully I get it on the first try. And already failing. Okay, there we go.
Beauty.
Thank you. So Ani Buju, Nimki Anishinabek Kwe Gigun Dodem, Wiikwemkoong Unceded. Hello and welcome everyone. My English name is Rachel Arsenault, and I am grateful for the opportunity to speak with you all today and have a conversation on climate change and water insecurity in First Nations communities. I also want to thank the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages for assisting me with this presentation and taking care of the logistics for us to gather here today. I also wanted to thank the Decolonizing Water Partnership Project, and their logo is also on the screen, for teaching me much of what I know on water insecurity and the impacts on Indigenous communities, and for all the researchers that mentored me while I worked with the partnership project. So that's researchers like Dr. Carrie Barassa, Dr. Sybil Diver, Dr. Erin Witham, Dr. Deborah McGregor, Dr. Karen Backer, Dr. M.A. Kraft, and I also want to thank my committee members, Angel Eluk and Ellie Perkins, and my supervisor, Deborah McGregor. So I'm also grateful to the Chiefs of Ontario Director of Environment, Kathleen Padulo, and all the Indigenous youth and elders that have inspired me to start the water advocacy efforts that led me to pursuing first a master's and then a PhD in these closely related fields. The title of my presentation today is Navigating Water Systems Change with the Ebb and Flow of Indigenous Knowledges. Most, if not all of you, know that World Water Day is on March 22nd, and I'm also glad to be a part of the many conversations around water that will be taking place this week. The background for most of these slides, including this one, are pictures of Manitoulin Island, which I took during my many travels there over the past few years. That's where my family comes from, as Ellie mentioned in the introduction. And the First Nation community that my family is from, Wiikwemkoong Unceded First Nation, is one of 5 communities located on the island. And while I don't know the water security status of Shagwenda and Shiging, my community is still heavily reliant on water trucks, despite having a water treatment plant which services the community center. And the outlying parts of the community, such as the community that my family is from, which is called Kaboni, is serviced by water trucks, which bring their own challenges with them. So my bopa, or a grandfather, as we say in my language, did not have running water in his home in Kaboni until I was 7 or 8 years old. And it was the same with my family members, my other family members that lived in Kaboni, like my aunt and one of my cousins. And one of my cousins still lives there, or two of them rather. So water trucks are still servicing that in other parts of the community to this day. And another community on the island, Zibahasing, is also impacted by water insecurity. And I learned this after attending a water gathering where I met a technician from Zibahasing, and they talked about all of the challenges that their community is facing. So out of the 5 communities on Manitoulin Island, that is 2 of them that I know of that are impacted by water insecurity. So while Indigenous peoples across Canada and globally are being impacted by water insecurity, these impacts are exacerbated by the impacts from climate change. And during my PhD research, I wanted to look at how different Indigenous peoples across Canada are being impacted by water insecurity and climate change, and to learn as much as I could about the adaptive approaches they are implementing to help make their communities more resilient to these impacts. From the research that I have done to date in this area, I will talk about what some of these adaptive approaches are later on in the presentation. Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island acknowledge women as the protectors of water. Women are seen as having the closest connection to water because they carry extra water within them when they carry their children in their wombs. And I wanted to share this quote of the Ojibwe creation story from the Ontario First Nations Environmental Assessment Technical Working Group, because storytelling is so ingrained in our culture. And this story in particular is the beginning of life as we know it, as we Ojibwe know it rather. And when I began pursuing Indigenous studies as part of my educational journey, I understand from researchers such as John Burroughs and Vine Deloria and Little Bear that storytelling is how we pass knowledge from generation to generation about living sustainably and living well with the earth. In Ojibwe, we have a saying, Mino B'Madzwin, which means living a good life. Many First Nation peoples in Ontario understand that living a good life means living well with the earth. Deborah McGregor wrote an article about this understanding in 2016. And since that time, I have read about this perspective from many other Indigenous researchers from the past and present. I remember reading Living Between Rocks and Water by John Burroughs, which dates all the way back to 1997, when he discussed how storytelling shaped traditional ecological knowledge that was used in his First Nation to protect the fish populations and practice sustainable fish harvesting. In my language, Mother Earth is called Wiikwemkoong Kwe and water is called Nibe. And with my own understanding, everything on Wiikwemkoong Kwe is a sacred gift that was given to us by the Creator. Indigenous peoples are seen as stewards and protectors of the land because they understand that the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food that we eat are gifts which must be respected, protected, and conserved. We also understand that living sustainably and living well with the earth is our connection to both our ancestors and the present and future generations. Our ancestors lived sustainably before us so that we could enjoy the same access to air, water, and food that they had access to. And in turn, we must also live sustainably and well with the earth so that the next 7 generations that come after us also have the same access to clean air, water, and land that we had. As an Anishinabek Kwe, I share these principles and values that shape our protocols around water. I wanted to share a bit about my background before I start talking about the research that I wanted to present to you all today. So I've been doing research on the First Nations water crisis and Indigenous water governance and what this looks like since I started doing my master's in 2016. I also worked for First Nations political organization for almost a decade. And while I was working for them, I got to experience my first water ceremony and water walk back in 2015. For First Nations, being stewards of the land and advocacy in all its forms are linked to ceremony because ceremony reminds us of our sacred responsibilities. Some of you may have heard about some of the Indigenous practices with sema, or tobacco as you call it in English. where we put tobacco down as a way of saying thank you or as a way of praying. And when we put tobacco down as a way of saying thank you, by doing this, we are acknowledging that we are taking only what we need. In the previous slide, I talked about storytelling, and now I want to talk about ceremonies and how these shape our Indigenous relationships with each other and the earth. And what you see on this slide are the articles which I was able to be a part of because some of the relationships that I have formed with other Indigenous researchers over the years. Researchers that I met through my master's courses or through the Decolonizing Water Partnership Project. Through extensive mentorship from researchers like Dr. Carrie Barassa, Dr. Sybil Diver, Dr. Erin Witham, Dr. Deborah McGregor, and Dr. Brittany Lubby, I was able to either collaborate on or write solo these articles that are listed here. I worked on several publications with the mentors that I just named and others. And the last one listed on here, an article that I collaborated on with two Indigenous individuals from the Navajo Nation in the United States, Dr. Andrew Curley and Dr. Teresa Montoya, as well as Dr. Nicole Wilson, who I also met through the Decolonizing Partnership Project, recently won an award with Water International, where it was published in 2021. I also owe a great deal of what I know, so my knowledge and experiences, to Indigenous youth, elders, and technicians that I was privileged to work with over the years. Technicians like Rhonda Gagnon at the Anishinabek Nation, Mike McKay at the Anishinaabe-Aski Nation, Kathleen Padulo at the Chiefs of Ontario office, and elders Gordon Wandamans Ba and Josephine Mandaman Ba, and Donna DeBosque and Caroline Recollet. And since I've begun this research, elders Gordon Wandamans and Josephine Mandaman have passed, which is why I added the Ba at the end of their name to signify their passing. And then there's the ever-inspiring youth that reminded me of their role and mine with water and our sacred responsibilities to future generations. Former youth council members like Quinn Miagwasike, Michael Moore, Tristan Schneider, Wasekam, Edward George, Megan Logan, Jeremy Monias, and Mark Hill, who is currently chief of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. And I also can't forget the leaders that assisted me with this journey as well. The chief of Batchewana First Nation, Dean Sayers, and former council member for Curve Lake First Nation, Slade McCallop. And for many Indigenous researchers, we also understand that we are accountable to all of those who share their knowledge with us and to do all that we can to amplify their voices. And before I dive into the research, I also want to take a moment to explain my usage of First Nations and my usage of Indigenous, since Indigenous peoples also applies to the Inuit and Métis peoples. And although I will speak a little bit about the Inuit and ecological grief, and a little bit about their adaptation and resiliency efforts, most of my background knowledge and the research that I conducted to do this presentation for you all today centers around First Nations specifically, which is not inclusive of the Métis and Inuit like the word Indigenous is. So I just wanted to put that out there before I continue. M.A. Craft has done a lot of research and writing on the Anishinaabe and Nakanagewin, or Anishinaabe laws, as you would say in English, and how these apply to Nibe. This image, taken from an article that M.A. Craft collaborated on with Lucas King in 2021, entitled Building the Treaty No. 3 Nibe Declaration Using an Anishinaabe Methodology of Ceremony. And I have read the Water Declaration by the First Nations in Ontario, and I've also read the National Water Declaration that was put forward by the Assembly of First Nations, and which they released a while back. And in all three of these declarations, unified Indigenous values, principles, and protocols are shared within them, which guide First Nation relationships to water. In the background, centering all of these principles, values, and protocols is a thunderbird, which for many Anishinaabe nations, centered around the Great Lakes and including nations south of the border in the United States as well, is a sacred mythological being, which is seen as a protector of water. And I will talk about the thunderbird briefly again when I discuss Melissa Nelson's work in an upcoming slide, but I wanted to quickly explain what the image is in the background. Also on the left wing is Minnow Benmadzewin, women's relationship duties and ceremonies. And on the right wing, you can see Mother Earth, relationships, generation, and honor and respect, which I also talked about. But another reason why I wanted to share this image is right in the center of the thunderbird, where the words creation, teachings, nationhood, and responsibility are all found. And all of these shared values, principles, and protocols are deeply intertwined with Indigenous knowledge systems and shape Indigenous laws and governance. And to kick off the discussion on water insecurity and climate change, I wanted to start with Melissa Nelson's article, The Hydromythology of the Anishinabek. Will Michipajou survive climate change, or is he creating it? This article explains how Indigenous storytelling and hydromythology could shape Indigenous perspectives on climate change and how they have helped shape the Indigenous relationships with the land, air, and water. As I discussed earlier, storytelling connects Indigenous peoples to the land, water, and animals, as well as their ancestors and present and future generations. Many Indigenous cultures in North America reflect on the stories that have been passed down from generation to generations for reminders on why they need to live well with the earth and take the animals of present future generations into consideration for their day-to-day activities. Also, as I mentioned previously, storytelling has also shaped Indigenous laws and the ways that Indigenous peoples pay their respect to nature. This image, which I pulled from the internet, is a petroglyph of Michipajou, who is a mythological being that lives in the Great Lakes. Often described as an underwater panther with copper scales, Michipajou is a reminder to the Indigenous nations around the Great Lakes to respect the water. In the case of Michipajou, he may be a cause for climate change because people may have forgotten about him and the other protectors of the land and waters due to a loss of Indigenous languages from colonization. For many Indigenous cultures in North America, there is a delicate balance between living sustainably and respecting and revering the gifts that people are given in the forms of clean air, water, and the animals around us. When people no longer respect the gifts that we're given and the beings and spirits which protect our environments, we lose sight of our connections and relationships to these gifts, and there are dire consequences. So Nelson also talks about Indigenous stories that are at risk of being lost by the loss of Indigenous languages, and how both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous ecological literacy, as she calls it, will get worse once the stories and teachings disappear. Nelson uses the example of how a mythical water protector can play a trickster role in teaching us about how our lack of actions has caused climate change. Within many Indigenous cultures in Canada, there are different versions of tricksters who inadvertently teach us how to live well by demonstrating the mistakes that can be made when things are off balance. And in this case, Nelson is discussing the role of the trickster with the imbalances that currently exist within our natural environments. Nelson talks about Michipajou from two perspectives. The first is from Michipajou being a victim of colonization, and the second is from the creator of climate change perspective. And on page 223, Nelson talks about how climate change has disrupted the migration patterns of fish, birds, and other wildlife, as well as the medicinal plants that Indigenous peoples rely on. The entire page discusses what Nelson refers to as climate disruption and ecological imbalance. And throughout this chapter, Nelson also talks about how the changing weather patterns due to climate change, negatively impact First Nations. Nelson discusses the melting of the ice caps, the water crisis, and how the entire water cycle itself has been disrupted. Due to the disruptions in the water cycle, there is an increase in flooding, precipitation, and storms as well. Another impact that Nelson talks about, which is just as critically important to Indigenous peoples, is the loss of cultural sites, including graveyards, which are lost during flooding in Indigenous territories. There are many impacts of climate change on Indigenous peoples, and even though I intentionally made the slide a little text heavy, these are only some of the causes, these are only some of the impacts that came up frequently in the articles that I read before presenting to you all today. There's another article that I read by Golden, Audit, and Smith that speaks to the impacts on communities in Northern Ontario and how even the very English terminology around climate change doesn't resonate with communities. Golden et al. Discuss the changes that the Cree have seen for what they call blue ice, and how this makes the ice conditions for their roads more treacherous, as the blue ice is no longer being a part of the winter months like it used to be, and how this makes the ice conditions for the roads more treacherous and their ice road season much shorter. For many, if not all communities dependent on ice roads, the ice road season is the only time of the year where they can transport essentials like medicine and food into their communities for a significantly reduced cost. and the shortening of the ice root season has devastating impacts as a result. Golden et al. Also talk about the changes to snow, which makes hunting and trapping up north much more difficult. And even further north than that, Dirkelek et al. And Ford et al. Also talk about the Inuit and some of the ways that Inuit communities are being impacted. Communities in the Arctic are being impacted by a limited availability of resources, ecological grief from the changes to their territories, and threats to their physical health by the changing ice conditions from climate change. And Dirkelek et al. Discuss the connections between the sea ice disappearing and the disruptions to livelihood, mental health impacts, and the loss of territory for the Inuit. In terms of the health risks caused by climate change, the Inuit are finding that their food sources are becoming contaminated, that there are more extreme weather events, increased risks from UV exposure, and increased risk of injury or death from changing ice conditions. Dirkelek et al. Also observed that changes to sea ice conditions in Inuit territory affected them mentally, socially, spiritually, culturally, as well as physically and economically, which is why I have ecological grief included in these impacts. Climate change is also exacerbating the effects of the First Nations water crisis on communities in Canada, as discussed by many authors, including Chiblo 2019, Hart et al. 2021, Wiikwemkoong et al. 2018, Mercer and Hanrahan 2017, and Patrick 2018. And these impacts range in severity and include flooding, drought, changes in water chemistry, and changes in water contaminants. And while most of his research focuses on First Nations in the prairies, Alberta and Saskatchewan, Patrick talks about how the impacts from extreme weather events, flooding, and droughts are impacting water quantity and quality. For example, flooding and heavy rainfall cause sewage lagoon capacity problems, and frequent freeze and thaw cycles throughout the winter can cause cracks in infrastructure. Patrick also states that changes in precipitation can have negative effects on community wastewater systems, and discusses the impacts from severe weather events on flooding and drought conditions. In terms of the flooding impacts on communities, one risk to water security is land-based contaminants becoming mobilized during floods. Patrick also states that there is a connection between wildfires and water insecurity, as wildfires disrupt water service and may contaminate water, change water temperatures, and may also compromise water treatment. Climate change impacts are also affecting entire watersheds and the vegetation which grows around watersheds. I also wanted to briefly talk about how climate change is impacting Indigenous cultures from both a food security aspect and a cultural one. Some of you may have heard about one of our traditional foods called manoomin, or wild rice in English. Manoomin is a culturally significant food source for many Indigenous peoples in Canada, which also requires very stable growing conditions, as fluctuations in water levels can cause them to become uprooted or not be able to undergo photosynthesis. Lehman talks about this in their article on manoomin ecology from 2020. Manoomin is also extremely sensitive to severe weather once it grows above the surface of water. In 2021, Kaleri et al. Also discussed the impacts that climate change has on the growth of species found in a boreal fen, the climate change impacts. That they studied for a decade rather. And finally, Tugas-Tellier et al. Found that climate change impacts environments by creating ideal growing conditions for some invasive species, such as Phragmites australis, or water reeds. The authors, Tugas-Tellier et al. State that this is due to a lack of extended ice cover in the winter months, which causes the water levels in the St. Lawrence to drop, thereby creating ideal growing conditions for the Phragmites. Climate change is also having a significant impact on aquatic species by affecting their growth, reproduction cycles, migration patterns, and predator and prey relationships. In 2016, Weatherden et al. Wrote about how Indigenous community harvesting practices are being affected in British Columbia and how they anticipate a significant decline in aquatic species along the Pacific coast by the year 2050. In 2020, Bowles et al. Conducted a similar study on how Indigenous peoples are having their fish harvesting practices disrupted by climate change, as Indigenous communities in Quebec have noticed that fish reproductive rates and their overall size has changed dramatically in the past decade. Earlier, I talked about the Indigenous relationships to the natural world and how these shape not just the Indigenous ways of life, but Indigenous governance structures as well. As an Anishinabek Kwe and as an Indigenous researcher, I understand how the spiritual, the natural, the customary, and the human are all intertwined. For Indigenous peoples, when one of these circles is impacted, then all of the circles are impacted. And that is why I really wanted to share this diagram to close off the discussion on the impacts. And as I mentioned, this is only a few of the impacts, given that there was a lot to discuss on this topic. And where I'm really interested in focusing my research is not on the negative impacts from climate change that Indigenous peoples are facing, but what communities are doing to adapt and build up their resiliency efforts. And I'm also interested in how this knowledge can be shared and potentially leveraged by other communities. For example, if there are adaptation techniques that are working for Indigenous communities on the Pacific coast, could these adaptation techniques also work for the Atlantic coast? And however, one issue that started emerging for me as a researcher in terms of adaptation efforts in Indigenous communities is that there are significant research gaps in this area. And I was very limited with open access articles on the topic of water and climate change. And open access articles and information sources are critically important for research that Indigenous peoples, communities, or organizations may want to do on this topic, or for climate change adaptation techniques in general. And a lot of this has to do with capacity and resources, which may be limited in communities and for Indigenous peoples in general. And another critically important piece in terms of access to research on this topic is open access research, which amplifies Indigenous voices. For this reason, I wanted to have another brief discussion on gray literature. Back in 2019, when I had to prepare a draft PhD program plan, I came across this report from Kate Middleton, and within it, there are many rich quotes from the elders, youth, technicians, and leaders that attended this climate summit. And those are the voices that we should be amplifying on this topic. And that is one of the challenges that I personally have come across. While there are several academic articles where Indigenous peoples were quoted and included, there is not nearly enough on this topic. And in my opinion, until there is, I think we may need to be more inclusive of the gray literature that we have available to us, where their voices are actually able to be heard. And while we're on the topic of reports, I also wanted to quickly mention these two reports released by the federal government, the Pan-Canadian Framework and the Healthy Environment and Healthy Economy reports, or HEHE, discuss Canada's action plans to counter the effects from climate change and build more resilient communities. Both reports also discuss how the government will work with Indigenous communities to implement these plans and policies. And the tree on the left, which was taken from the HEHE report, has protecting lands and waters and establishing Indigenous protective areas as the root or foundation for growing a healthy environment and economy. The HEHE also states Canada's intention to, and I'm quoting page 10 of this document, partner with First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation to advance Indigenous climate leadership and ensure federal policies and programs which are designed to address Indigenous peoples' climate priorities, end quote. The Pan-Canadian Framework also talks about supporting Indigenous peoples' economic and social rights through what they call an Indigenous navigator, because I am sharing a quote from page 7 of this document. And the quote reads, information from the Indigenous navigator complements that ILP official statistical data demonstrating that Indigenous peoples face significant obstacles in access to education and vocational training, have fewer opportunities in the formal economy, and encounter in heightened and specific vulnerabilities and risks of exposure to violations of fundamental rights at work, including discrimination in employment and occupation, child labor, and forced labor, end quote. In an earlier slide, I was talking about the report that Golden et al. Did on not only the impacts that the Cree were facing in terms of changing ice and snow conditions, but also how the use of climate change terminology does not always resonate with First Nations and Indigenous peoples in general. An example of this was shared by Golden et al., where the English words adaptation, which could not be translated into Cree, and continuity, which could be translated into Cree, which is what the Cree choose to use in place of adaptation. This is yet another example of why we need to not only include Indigenous voices in climate change and water security conversations, but also do what we can to amplify them. To mitigate the impacts of climate change on watersheds, researchers understand that there is a critical need to include Indigenous knowledge in adaptation and resiliency efforts, as this will greatly enhance the outcomes from these efforts, as discussed by Chiblo in 2019 and Environment and Climate Change Canada, or the ECC, in 2020. The ECC also discusses the role that healthy and resilient ecosystems play in preventing soil erosion and providing buffers against flooding and droughts, cooling cities, sequestering carbon, and threats to food production while having positive influences on mental health. Researchers are also looking at the different techniques and strategies that Indigenous peoples are using to adapt and build more resilient communities. In 2021, Hart et al. Discussed what they call a water sovereignty approach in their article on Indigenous community-led programs to address food and water insecurity. A water sovereignty approach, and I quote from page 2, is based on underlying values whereby land, water, humans, and nature are integrated and Indigenous knowledge systems are prioritized, end quote. Furthermore, and again, I'm quoting from page 2, in cases where this approach has been adopted and Indigenous communities are directly engaged in management of rivers and catchments, better environmental and health outcomes are consistently experienced. Thus, community-led programs are crucial for sustainable solutions for Indigenous peoples because they use a rights-based and decolonizing approach and may also provide an effective model for food and water security efforts more generally, end quote. The authors examined academic articles and gray literature from around the world to draw their conclusions. Also in 2021, Varanasi et al. Discussed the adaptation efforts made by some of the Indigenous communities on the Pacific coast. Some of the Indigenous strategies on the Pacific coast involve a growing understanding of how human genetics respond to toxins in marine environments, knowledge sharing among youth and elders, and establishing programs to alert resources managers about harmful algal blooms. In the Canadian far north, the Inuit are also learning to adapt by switching from hunting caribou to harvesting fish and aquatic species, which was discussed by Ford et al. In 2020. Other Inuit in the far north are learning to adapt to water insecurity issues caused by climate change through domestic rainwater harvesting, as discussed by Mercer and Hanrahan in 2017. However, domestic rainwater harvesting can only be used for what Mercer and Hanrahan call general purposes, unless it is treated by a filtration system to make it more fit for human consumption. So it has its limitations. Earlier, I had also discussed a report done by Robert Patrick in 2018, which discussed his research findings after working with and for Indigenous communities out west. In this specific article, Patrick argues that source water protection planning is one technique that communities can use to adapt to climate change. He says that this can be accomplished because source water protection planning requires taking land use activities, human activities, and naturally occurring processes into consideration. He also discusses the different management and adaptation strategies which can be implemented by communities, which he calls a multi-barrier approach, or MBA. He states that this approach has been used effectively with other non-Indigenous communities which were impacted by water insecurity, including Walkerton. He also stated that these systems have only failed in the past because they did not take climate change into consideration for the source water protection phase of the multi-barrier approach, and that there was limited oversight and differences in distribution systems used by municipalities and First Nations communities. Finally, Patrick talked about how he brought in several community advisors, including technicians and elders, to ensure that these source water protection plans would work well for the community. Patrick understood that the only way to assist with generating adaptation techniques and potential solutions for communities was to include them in discussions and empower them to establish and implement Indigenous-led approaches to resolving these ongoing challenges. So the image on the right in this slide is a sketch that I did of the Indigenous governance system based on the teachings that I received about our clan systems and how each clan around the circle has a role to play, and each clan must live in harmony and balance with the other clans. There is no hierarchy here, and each clan is interconnected with all of the other clans as visualized using a seven-pointed star. And within this system is every color, and no matter our ancestry, we all belong to one of these clans. And by that, I mean, regardless of who your parents are, for the Indigenous communities that follow these clan systems, you belong to one of these clans, even if you don't fully know how far back your family or ancestry goes. You would be part of the Martin clan. So I wanted to share this sketch because so much of Western knowledge is placed in silos. And what I discussed with you today is so much more than environmental science or geography or social studies. It's also health, mental health. And if you are ever interested in reading more about Indigenous collaboration techniques, which attempt to remove the silos placed around knowledge, then I strongly recommend reading John Burroughs' work. He articulates this a lot more clearly than I probably did right now. But where I'm going with this is that the adaptation techniques and potential solutions require cross-sectoral collaboration. And I've noticed that more recently, different government branches have begun collaborating with each other on some of these tougher issues. And we need to ensure that Indigenous peoples, communities, organizations, and voices in general, the voices of the youth, the voices of our elders and technicians as well as leaders, because this is impacting all of us. Before I go into the conclusions that I have drawn from this research, I will provide some background on why I chose this photo to share with you all for the conclusion. So this photo was taken outside of Queen's Park in Toronto in 2016 during a rally for Grassy Narrows, which is a First Nations community that has been dealing with the impacts of mercury poisoning from their contaminated waterways since the 1960s. So that was 60 years ago. And yet it has impacted generation after generation of the people from Grassy Narrows. And every time I look at this picture, it reminds me of all the work that is yet to be done. There is a lot when it comes to water insecurity impacting First Nation communities. And as I have reiterated several times in the last 30 minutes or so, these impacts are exacerbated by climate change. And I provided several examples of how. And despite all of the examples that I shared and all of the articles and reports that I was able to find, I encountered, as I mentioned, several research gaps on this topic. There was far more research speaking to the impacts of climate change and water insecurity on Indigenous communities than there is research about the adaptation techniques and strategies that Indigenous communities are using. And it's not to say that these don't exist, but that not enough is being written about them for one reason or another. And as I continue down the path towards the proposal writing and dissertation components of my PhD, I aspire to highlight these research gaps and hopefully provide some recommendations on how they can be filled through inclusive research and amplifying Indigenous voices. Because I have been stressing during this entire presentation, the Indigenous voices on this topic are the most critical ones. There was a saying or a quote that I heard, and it definitely applies to this topic, and that's "nothing about us without us." And unfortunately, I can't recall whose quote that is at the moment. I'm sure it'll come back to me a couple of hours from now. But for my next comprehensive, I intend to do a scoping review, and this will be the next step that I will take in highlighting the gaps, as well as highlighting the research that has already been done on Indigenous climate justice and colonialism, which is very closely related to everything that I discussed here today. I wanted to thank you all for joining me here today and allowing me to open this conversation for us to have. I believe there is 20 to 25 minutes for questions. But before we get to that, I wanted to thank the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages at York for assisting me with this presentation, as well as providing me with the opportunity to speak. And I also wanted to thank the Decolonizing Water Partnership Project for all of the teachings that I was able to undertake while working as a student with them. Again, thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you, Rachel, so much for that amazing presentation. My head is spinning with all of the information and insights that you shared. It's amazing, wonderful. We now have time for discussion of what Rachel has shared. And if you have questions or thoughts that you'd like to share, you can enter them in the chat, which I'm going to open here. And you can also raise your hands in just a minute. I want to, while people are thinking, just say one little thing, which is that Rachel's webinar today is part of World Water Week, which is being marked at York today with a water-focused exhibit all day long in Very Hall Rotunda. And also the United Nations this week is holding a 3-day conference marking the midterm review of the UN Decade for Action on Water and Sanitation, which is 2018 to 2028. So this is the midterm review of that. Some Indigenous knowledge holders are reclaiming space in these kinds of international forums, like the UN and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the conferences of the parties. But as Angel Aluk and Graham Reed shared in another cycle webinar on March 9, Smudging in Sharm el-Sheikh, the long days of emotional and intellectual work explaining how colonialism and Western worldviews and uses of power have caused and continue to worsen the climate and water crisis. This can be exhausting for Indigenous representatives who come to those meetings. And their message is sometimes even met with violence, as they shared in their seminar. Graham Reed called on non-Indigenous researchers and activists to devote parallel work to unpacking how the concepts that undergird water and climate crises originate in certain Western colonial patterns of thinking, such as, for example, trying to value environmental services provided by nature, or ignore non-economic losses, and how all of this undermines well-being. So there's a lot of research, Graham said, that needs to be done, and it doesn't have to be done by Indigenous peoples. Some of the research and sharing does definitely have to be done by Indigenous peoples. But the IPCC today had a press conference in Geneva announcing their synthesis report, which ends the 6th assessment cycle of reporting on climate change. And they stated that in future cycles, they are definitely going to be attempting to include Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge more fully in their reporting process. So I do have a question for you, Rachel, and I wonder if you would like to comment on this and the change processes that do seem to be underway. What is your take on all of this? Thanks. And everybody else, put your questions in the chat or raise your hands, please. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, that's so much to unpack. I almost would have needed you to write all that into the chat to be able to respond probably to all the different things that you touched on as you were going through everything. But I just started recently working for the Assembly of First Nations, and I do definitely agree somewhat with what Graham had to say. But the other piece to that is that there are also a lot of, or what I've actually heard a lot of Indigenous peoples expressing more recently, is that they're not necessarily looking to the non-Indigenous researchers to resolve some of their issues. What they want is to be included in the process. And they want to make sure that Indigenous-led approaches are coming first, as opposed to non-Indigenous led approaches, which have largely failed a lot of Indigenous communities, especially historically. So I don't know, it's so complex, but my take on it is that from everything that I understand from all the research that I've done to date, Indigenous communities are looking for Indigenous-led approaches first and foremost. And second, they're looking for inclusion when it comes to any other approaches that may or may not work for their communities. But their voices need to be included in those initiatives in order for them to actually work for their communities. I hope I articulated that right.
Yeah, thank you so much. At the UN meeting, we Jessica Kishig-Martin is going to be speaking, and she's made a presentation where she talked about the ceremony of creating a space at the table for the water. And so I asked her what about doing that at our side event at the UN? And she said, can we smudge in the room? Can it be a ceremony? So Sapna, the head of the delegation from York, emailed the UN and finally got them to answer. And they said, oh, no, you can't have any kind of burning materials in the building. And I found a video online of Indigenous women at UN Women's Gathering about 10 years ago who went outside and smudged among the flags. But that's different from doing it in the space and creating ceremony in the space. So I just tell this story because there's a long way to go before Indigenous knowledge holders can really be comfortable sharing in these Western venues.
I completely agree with you. And if you like, I can actually share a success story that I heard recently on a project that I was working for the Yellowhead Institute. I had the privilege and the honor to interview my then chief of the community, so former chief Duke Peltier from Wiikwemkoong Unceded First Nation. And he was the chief for a very long time. I think he served 3 terms. But he was saying that when he was part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty Commission and those gatherings and all of the work that's been done to that to date, before they actually go into the courtroom, they do ceremony together, they do pipe ceremony together. And that has been a big, large part of the process. So I thought that was really cool. And that was like one of the things that he talked about when we did the interview. And yeah, it was just really great to hear that this actually is being done in some cases. So I think we're slowly getting there. But yeah, we still got some work to do for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of advocacy that needs to happen. Okay, do we have any questions from those who are here today about what Rachel shared? You can raise your hands.
Hi.
Or jump in. Hillary, go ahead.
Hello. Hi, Rachel. Thank you so much. I really appreciated all the effort and time you gave to us today. And yeah, it was a great presentation. I have a very broad question, and it doesn't have to be a specific answer. It's more just to hear more of your thoughts. You talked about kind of the challenge of using adaptation as the word for transition in terms of the thinking of this intergenerational time and our adjustment to climate change. I think that's a fascinating and challenging consideration as we do try to incorporate knowledge that isn't kind of Eurocentric and Western in terms of language and how that can be representative of more complex and holistic ways of thinking about climate change and adaptation as we understand it. So I don't really have a question, but I would wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on that from your perspective and from your experience, what that means for you and maybe for the people who you've worked closely with.
Sure, and thank you for asking that. So one thing that I was really trying to stress off and on and throughout the entire presentation that I just gave is all of the components that go into the Indigenous culture and how that comes into play when they're doing decision-making processes. And, a big part of that is language. A big part of that is their knowledge systems and their perspectives. It's the water declaration, it's the land declaration, it's their laws, and they're all intertwined. So language is one piece of that. And that's why I was trying to say it's one piece of the larger whole. There's so many different interconnected pieces that go into what shapes Indigenous perspectives on anything. And that's just one part. That's why their voices need to be included in these conversations, or our voices, I should say. But mine's just one perspective as well, right? There's so many other different types of perspectives that need to be shared, not just mine. So yeah, thank you for asking that. I hope I did it justice.
Yeah, no, that was great. I really find it's incredibly important. So it's interesting to hear more. Thank you.
I feel like I'm still letting all that sink in. You shared so many thoughts and a lot of work that I had not heard about before. Natalie, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, Rachel, for your talk. Somewhat outside the field, I have a question about the image that you drew, the 7-point star. And I was wondering, is that something that you're hoping to put into your dissertation? Like, is there space to provide visuals like that? Or was it kind of just you trying to kind of conceptualize some of these concepts? It was beautiful, by the way.
Thank you. Actually, it wasn't something that I was intending to build into my research. But when I was putting together all the slides for this presentation, I realized, it's so content heavy. And there's so many different parts of Indigenous, like the Indigenous culture and Indigenous practices, and that speak to the protocols, the values, and the priorities. And I wanted to share that to demonstrate just how interconnected everything is. That was my intention there. And it's funny that you asked me that, because Dr. Deborah McGregor asked me the same question and said that, I technically could have used it as part of my work. The only issue with that is it takes me so very long to put together art pieces, and that's just a sketch. But if I actually wanted to put it on canvas, it would probably take me like at least a month or two full time. So yeah, that's one of the challenges. I would love to include it, but it's just something that I didn't think of almost right up until I was doing this presentation. So yeah.
It is beautiful. I love what you said about non-hierarchical, and everyone has a space. Like right there. Hello.
And a role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Angel, go ahead.
I don't really have a question. I also just want to say that was such a great presentation of Indigenous perspectives on water and bringing together the water crisis and climate change crisis. And I thought it was really wonderful. And as to add to Natalie's question, I know one of our colleagues that's on this call, Sean Hillier, uses art in some of his research methodologies. So that might be something to consider as well, is incorporating the star and the art around that in your dissertation and your work. But I don't know if I have a question, but you said something about there's a lot more research on like Indigenous peoples and water crisis than there is on adaptation. And I wonder if that's from like a Western perspective. I think Eve Tuck and others call it like damage-based research, like just wanting to study like the things that are wrong instead of the solutions that are out there. And as you were speaking, I recall one of my colleagues that I work with, Crystal Lehman from Treaty 6 territory, when she used to be the climate change coordinator for Treaty 6. One thing she did was she had this document where she translated the term climate change into all of the languages in Treaty 6 territory. And then she would use that to have discussions with communities and technicians. So I know like communities are out there doing work and adapting in different ways and working together. And so I'm wondering if you've also reached this conclusion of like this Western focus on like almost like trauma porn and damage-based research that just wants to look at the problems of Indigenous people, but not like the great things that community is doing.
Thank you, Angel. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say that was exactly what my purpose was when I said that. And the terminology that I read around that, which is usually put forward by Indigenous peoples when they're talking about creating research that will actually have transformative impacts and changes for communities. It's not going to come from what they call deficit-focused research. It's going to come from what's actually being done by communities, their Indigenous-led approaches, and what they're actually doing to make their communities more resilient, as opposed to creating more research that just speaks to what's actually impacting them which can actually have even more damaging impacts on communities. From an Indigenous researcher perspective that I've read from a couple of sources, including Murdoka, which I was able to read when I did my coursework way back in 2019 for my PhD. Was one of the first times that I ever heard about that. And I know that Chalisa from the University of Botswana also talks about that. Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up and for helping me put emphasis on that. But that's exactly what I meant by that statement. We don't need more deficit-focused research and more research talking about the bad things that are happening. We need more research speaking to the good the communities are actually doing and what's being done to build more resiliency.
Angel, can I ask another question? It's about the HEHE report, Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy, and you quoted their statement that establishing Indigenous protected areas is the root of tackling climate change. This ties land back and water protection and climate change together. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how that report was received, but also how we can take that message forward.
I think that most of the critiques that I hear from government reports is that not enough Indigenous perspectives are usually included in them, especially in the creation of them. But there's a lot of talk about Indigenous partnerships and that kind of thing. Yeah. I don't really know what I could say in terms of critiquing the HEHE report, but I did want to share some of what it says about the government intentions to include Indigenous perspectives with their work going forward on that, which was the only reason why I wanted to include it in our conversation today. I did have something to add, and now totally my train of thought just derailed.
It'll come back. That report was done. Do you know what's the agency?
Oh, IPCAs. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
The only thing that I was going to add for that is there's also a lot of negative history around IPCAs and establishing those as well, that a lot of environmental not-for-profits are actually understanding of, just how protected areas and protected areas overall were done previously without Indigenous inclusion and input into establishing those. And then now there's suddenly a drive to be more inclusive of Indigenous peoples in those, but just understanding that there is some negative history there as well when it comes to the establishment of protected areas. And that now it's really nice that they have more of a focus on establishing Indigenous protected areas and being more inclusive, but just being mindful that there's a history there as well.
Yeah, thanks for that context. Okay, we have lots of nice questions in the chat, which I have been neglecting, so I apologize for that. Kevan Maleki asks, to facilitate inclusiveness in research activity, do you think developing a type of glossary of terms where the meaning of the concepts like resiliency, continuity, sustainability, restoration, conservation can be clarified from the Indigenous perspectives? Kevan, I don't know if you want to turn on your camera or just leave me to read it out. You're welcome to intervene yourself, but go ahead, Rachel.
Sure, and thank you for that question, Kevan, and also hello. So for that, yeah, I think that is definitely something that I would love to build into my own research when I get to actually being able to write my dissertation. That's something that I actually did when I was writing my master's thesis as well, is just including what I meant by each of the terms that I put forward. And I think that also should be done with, like you said, the example of continuity and adaptation, and how more meaningful words can be selected by Indigenous peoples on these kind of topics. I completely agree with you. And that's something, like I said, I would love to build into my own research. Thank you for asking.
That really relates to what you said also about what words can and can't be translated into particular Indigenous languages, and how that, you know, our ability to think about things is often shaped by our ability to express concepts. So that there's a whole journal article there, Rachel, when you get done your dissertation. Okay, Anna Santonge, hi Anna, says, thank you, Rachel, for your presentation. Do you want to turn on your camera, Anna, and just ask this, or shall I read it?
Hi, sorry, just
Hi.
had to stop eating my lunch. Yeah, sorry, it took me a long time, Rachel, to sort of formulate what I wanted to say, but I'd really be interested, since I work at the libraries, to hear more about your experience as a researcher, finding that kind of gray literature. And if you've experienced sort of bit rot, where you find something in the process of your research, but then you're going back to fix up your footnotes or get some clarity, and the pages or the PDF's no longer there. Just because I know in the libraries where we often are trying to capture this kind of really important government, often it's framed as GovDocs, so government documentation. But especially if community is developing these materials and making them available, how does OCAP principles sort of fit into that conversation? Thanks.
That's a really excellent question. And you're completely right about that. So one example that I can share with you is something that happened or occurred while I was doing my master's thesis. So I actually I read the report that Human Rights Watch did in 2016, Make It Safe. And within that report, there was tons and tons and tons of really, really amazing quotes from Indigenous community members and folks that they spoke with, technicians from all over Ontario, which was really phenomenal. The only issue with that is like a lot of their writing pieces as well that were incorporated into that report. And I heard this criticism shared by technicians that I met that were actually interviewed for this report. They were not even credited with sharing their information. So they did actually share some of the voices that communities were sharing, which is the whole reason why I put so much focus and emphasis into what they were saying. Plus, it also resonated with the issues that were actually happening in communities. The communities were, or that the folks that actually participated in my master's that came from communities were voicing you know, the challenges they were facing and everything like that. But yeah, that was one thing that really did not sit well with me, was just thinking about for all the voices that they did amplify and included, there was also a lot of credit that wasn't given where it was due. And that's another issue with that, with gray literature, which is why I actually focused on the Kate Middleton Wiikwemkoong report when I was doing my presentation. Because she's one of the few that I know that did not do that. And then I also know Indigenous researchers that come in and do these kind of reports. They usually do a good job of making sure that they credit everybody who's involved in the process and helping them write the report. But it's just not always being done, especially by non-Indigenous organizations that probably mean well, like Human Rights Watch, but just things like that. So thanks for bringing that up.
That's great. It's sloppy research to not credit your sources, right? I'm sorry, that's Western research principles, right? Don't do that. You're not good. Okay, Angel also added something in the chat about the critiques of the Hihi report, and it's very interesting to hear. You know, you can't understand these things out of context, and it's nice to have a discussion about what's going on with all of these articulations of what's going on now. Benita Lawrence says, I loved your presentation, and Angel's comments as well. Andrea Brazier, who is a master's student in UC, she says, thanks for asking this question about Anna, about sourcing, and says she's really interested in that too. So there's a group of people who could be working together on this, maybe on that article that you're going to write out, Rachel, one of these days. Okay, Angel says, the Cree trickster in me thinks it's fitting. Do you want to say, Angel? Go ahead. I don't need to read this.
Oh, I just think it's fitting that the Fed's report is the acronym HEHE because it's kind of a joke in how it actually incorporates Indigenous knowledge and tokenizes our knowledges. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, not so hee for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
I also wanted to say a quick hello to Dr. Lawrence, who is also on here. So when I was a TA for her class, that's actually where I came across the source from Nelson on Mishipaju. So thank you for that, Professor Lawrence.
Bonita, do you want to ask your question about Trask? Maybe not. She said in the chat, I'm wondering if Nothing About Us Without Us doesn't come from the late Honai K. Trask. There's a real history prior to these recent environmental resiliency struggles that shows this work is part of a whole continuum and history of Indigenous empowerment. Yeah, good points. The reason I'm reading these things from the chat and trying to get them into the transcript and into the video is that sometimes there's a disconnect in Zoom. So I just want to make sure it all gets recorded as part of our discussion today. And Jill shares about COPs and water ceremonies off-site from the main venue near bodies of water. Yeah, and I was at the COP in Marrakesh, and at that was the one right after the Paris Conference of the Parties on Climate Change, and Indigenous delegates at that meeting were really discouraged that the language about Indigenous participation from Paris didn't get translated and really implemented in the agreement at Marrakesh. So it's like one step forward and then maybe 3/4 of a step back. It's a constant struggle to get these things really to build and feel that there's any progress. I think that's true. Okay, so any more questions or comments that anyone would like to raise? I would just like to salute you again, Rachel, for all of your hard work on this and for pulling it together and for being the center, naming this as an issue and then working on it yourself. Because as you said, nothing about us without us. So that means, it's so important to have Indigenous voices and researchers and people with academic credentials and that ability to work in the Western world, but also so grounded in Indigenous knowledges and willing to share those things. And I know it's exhausting sometimes. It must be so hard, but I really appreciate it. I think we all do and really respect your work. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you again to all of you for joining me. And also, Ellie, I'm also very motivated. It's definitely a very daunting task, but yeah, I definitely have a lot of motivation when it comes to this kind of work and doing everything that I can to support what's already being done on this and drive more voices forward.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining us today.